Equal amounts of flour and yeast water. Mix them together. Leave for 12 to 18 hours. And that's how I make Poolish. I've probably only done this like a million times. It's ridiculously easy and it brings a lot to the bread. So in this video, I'm going to go through the basics of it, such as what it really is and why it's beneficial. I typically use fruit yeast water to make it, and that's kind of the focus of this video. However, it can also be used with instant yeast with many of the same benefits. So to start with, what is Poolish really? Well, to know Poolish, we gotta know Preferment. It's a type of Preferment. A Preferment is normally just some flour, water, yeast, occasionally salt and or other ingredients, mixed up, left to ferment for a while before being added to whatever bread dough you're making. So it's basically just making a part of the dough in advance. There are a lot of variations in how exactly the Preferment is made. Our main focus, the type I use the most, Poolish, is frequently associated with French baking. It's generally a pretty wet Preferment, typically having a 1-to-1 ratio of flour to water. Its high hydration makes it quite easy to mix in a dough as well, which is a big benefit. But aside from Poolish, there are quite a few other types of Preferment. Some called sponge, others called biga, there's one called pâte fermentée. All of them have interesting backstories, and depending on the country, you may find them more frequently mentioned there. They may have varying hydrations, so some Preferments have more liquid or less, making them stiffer or less so. They can also have more than flour, water, and yeast in them. Pâte fermentée, for example, frequently has salt added in, and there are also enriched Preferments, so Preferments with things like eggs, milk. A thing to keep in mind though, there isn't a definitive standard for what each Preferment type is. So you may see one recipe calls their Preferment a Poolish, another calls the exact same thing a sponge. It can be all over the place. So there's no need to worry about memorizing all these names or knowing exactly what they are. Just being generally familiar with them is good enough. You'll eventually get used to them. So with that introduction to Preferments, let's continue on to why we should use them. What are the benefits of Preferments? They can have different names, methods, timings, ingredients, and results, but the underlying idea behind their benefits is the same. All these Preferments share a common basic trait in that they are left to ferment for at least a while before being added into main dough. It's in the name, Preferment. This is the key highlight of a Preferment. During the time we ferment the Preferment, a lot of good things happen. First off, while fermenting, small amounts of acid are produced in the Preferment. This acid has a good strengthening effect on the dough's gluten structure. It also makes it easier to knead the final dough, because a part of it already has some gluten developed. The second benefit Preferment offers is a longer shelf life, again due to the acids produced in the Preferment. The third benefit, however, is probably the main reason why we use Preferment. You see, while it's fermenting away on the countertop, the enzymes and yeast in there really get to work. They create some incredibly aromatic and complex tastes that are associated with really good bread. In fact, you can smell it immediately when you take off the plastic cover of the Preferment. And while there are small amounts of acid in the Preferment, they don't really show up in the final bread when tasted because there isn't that much produced. Now let's get to the specifics. As I've said before, this video is going to focus mainly on the Poolish type of Preferment that I mainly use. Although Poolish is generally made with flour, water, and instant yeast, I typically use fruit yeast water as my leavening agent. This Poolish method is particularly suitable for fruit yeast water because it allows us to watch over the Poolish and control how much yeast is in there. While it's not exactly like a standard Poolish, I'd say for all bread making purposes, I found that it works in pretty much the same way and haven't had too many issues with it. To make the Poolish, I always just measure out equal amounts of fruit yeast water and flour. If you wanted to use instant yeast here, you definitely could. However, you'd have to adjust the amount of yeast you add to how long you want the Poolish to ferment for. After you've got all the ingredients in the bowl, whether it's fruit yeast water or instant yeast, there isn't much technique needed in mixing it. Just mix it together until it's homogeneous and you see no dry flour lying around. The Poolish will look lumpy right after mixing. It's perfectly fine. Just give it a couple of hours, it'll settle down and then rise up. How long I leave the Poolish made with fruit yeast water for typically depends on room temperature. If it's a very warm day, it can get up to 30 degrees Celsius here. Poolish will probably be done in around 8 to 10 hours. If it's cooler, it could take up to 18 hours. If you used instant yeast, then this time would be heavily dependent on how much yeast you added as well. It can be quite variable. That's why it's a good idea to check on your Poolish frequently. Sometimes it's possible to think the Poolish didn't rise at all when it already rose and then fell. Here's a time lapse of a Poolish's progression over 18 hours. You can see that at first it relaxes and then it rises all the way up before coming down. If you were to use the Poolish at this over-fermented stage, you'd find it to be very sour smelling because of all the acid in there, and it would also be extremely weak, so it'd be pouring out like a liquid. Depending on how far gone it is, it may even have some liquid pooling on the sides. On the flip side, the characteristics of under-fermented Poolish are that when it's in its container, it still has a sort of very puffed up surface. It's very airy and gassy. At this stage, there's still plenty of a way to go for the yeast. They haven't fully maxed out production yet. So if we were to use the Poolish at this stage, we wouldn't get as many of the complex tastes that we'd like. We also wouldn't have as much yeast as we'd like. So it's like the Goldilocks story. Not too much and not too little. We gotta be just ripe. When it is just right, it should have this appearance. So the surface is still puffed up, however, it's showing signs of deflating. So some parts have already sunken down, there should be a lot of bubbles. This is a good Poolish. The test we can run on our Poolish is simple. Just take a small portion of it, scoop it up, and then drop it into a bowl of water. If it floats, then we're good. Note that, of course, extremely over-fermented Poolish or under-fermented Poolish will not pass this test. As you're adding it in, you should be able to notice the good gluten development when the Poolish comes out of the bowl. Then we can add the liquids into the Poolish and continue with the bread recipe as normal. If it's a dough that's kneaded, then with that Poolish in, it should be able to knead up a lot faster. And that's it for this video on Poolish. Thanks for watching. Now you know how to use Poolish.